Welcome, everyone. My name is Maggie Wiley, and I am the Communications Coordinator at Meridian University. Thank you for joining us for our ongoing conversation series, The Soul at Work. We encourage listeners to participate in these conversations by asking questions using the Q&A feature. You can participate by clicking Ask a New Question in the lower right corner. Today's conversation is titled Presence at Work. In the context of work, presence can be viewed as a desirable quality. We have intentions for evoking and invoking this presence, yet we also know that we are required to have non-judgmental awareness of what arises. This conversation will explore how each of us understands and engages with the notion of presence at work. We'll be hosted today by Jonathan Reams. He serves as Meridian faculty, is a co-founder for the Center of Transformative Leadership and the European Center for Leadership Practice. He has a position at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He also serves as editor-in-chief of Integral Review. And I know personally that he likes to bring fun into his work as much as possible. I'll now turn the conversation over to him to introduce his fellow panelists. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Maggie. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, thanks to Meridian University for hosting this event and for creating the space for these kind of conversations to happen in the world. I've known of Meridian for a long time and thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to participate in and contribute to the work that they're fostering in the world. Before I introduce the panel, I want to just say a word about the invitation and the topic. The notion of soul at work can evoke many things for us. And in that context, the notion of presence and related to soul becomes a kind of central feature. And in addition to that, the notion of what is our work in the world, work in the sense of a capital W and our sense of purpose and meaning of why we're here. And it was when crafting this invitation that Meridian sent me to host this panel that I then thought, well, who would I like to be involved in this kind of conversation? Who do I feel has a quality of presence in my experience that for one reason or another contributes something to, for myself, how I've been able to show up in the world? And so I'm just going to introduce briefly each person here on the panel kind of in the order they're showing up on the bottom of my screen at the moment, which means I start with the lovely Anne Kaspari, who is in Basel, Switzerland, and has been working with integral theory, theory U, presencing work, consciousness-raising work for a number of years. I ran into her through a common friend at a workshop in Germany and suddenly noticed that she was doing very interesting things. And since then, we've had the opportunity to work together in South Africa, around Europe, and also present at the Integral Theory Conference together. And so in a few minutes, Anne and each panelist will have some time to say something about themselves and their statement about this. And for now, I'm just going to introduce everybody. August Churak, I had met in 2002 at a conference called Inward Bound, which was one of the most intense, alive experiences I ever had. And that intensity was fueled in large part by Augie's presence. And so in subsequent meetings with him and work with him and engaging in the work he has done in the recent book he wrote, Business Secrets of the Trappist Monks, what I've noticed is a raw quality of presence that comes through, and you can't help but kind of take notice. It's a force of nature. And so that has influenced me in terms of how do you be present with this kind of intensity. So then Bob Anderson, I think I first met in 2003 on a conference call. I read an interview a friend of mine did, and I said, I got to meet this guy. I got to take this leadership circle thing. Called him up. He says, oh, yeah, okay, come on out. And, after 3 days of this training, I said to him, I said, I've got 7 years of graduate study in leadership and integral theory and consciousness studies. And you've somehow taken all that I learned and more and put it into one simple, elegant way to aid people on their developmental journey. And the presence that he brings to engaging that work has inspired me to not only use those tools, but to really find a way to foster that kind of developmental work in the business world. And then finally, Bonita Roy, there she is, suddenly showed up in the journal Integral Review through one of our colleagues, and she submitted this paper, and we all wondered, what do we do with this? There was the most kind of far out there advanced thinking we'd come across. We thought, how do we help massage and edit this into something that's palatable for the general public? And that involved a lot of conversation and process, and since then, there's been a journey where Bonnie has continually been evolving and refining and, in a way, presencing in written and verbal form this deep sense of perception of what is going on in the world in very subtle ways and how to support organizing that in very intense and interesting ways. So that's a little bit of my take of who these people are, why I bothered to invite them here, and why I'm very much looking forward to a conversation with everybody this evening. Evening because some of us are over here in Europe. So what we thought we would do is just start by having each person, starting again on the left with Anne, running then through Augie, Bob, and then Bonnie, have each person take 3 to 4 minutes to just kind of give an opening statement about what does this notion of presence at work mean to you. So Anne, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, thank you for the introduction. Presence at work. First of all, we work with presence, the other way around. We presence with work, or we work with presence as a means to a certain participation in the workplace that doesn't necessarily involve other people, that kind of intense participation, but it's the way you show up. We do work with presence and about presence, and the two of us have also written an article on the quality of presence that opens up a space. And we've been diving into what does it actually mean. We took it apart, the notion of presence, and put it back together, and having a look. What does it do, presence, and what it is? What are its parts? We had a look at intuition, and we had a look at your personal integrity. It's because you cannot be really present to anything or to anybody if you're, full of projections and filters. So there's a way that you would work on that first before you engage in the workplace or with a coachee or with a colleague. And then we had also a look, and I do also work with Bonnie there, on what does presence also mean in a collective space. What does this quality of presence do with a group of people, and what is the stuff that comes up, and to work through that, and to get to the most amazing insights and ways to be with people that is non-linear in a way, that is not just, okay, I'm attentive to my space, I listen carefully to people, probably what we mean by that kind of presence is something that goes much deeper, and it's both a capacity for ourselves being in that space and an effect it has on other people. So that's what we've been exploring, and we had a lot of fun with it too.
Thanks for that, Anne. So, Augie, what is your sense of this notion of presence at work?
No, it started me off on different trains of thoughts, just kind of letting thoughts bang around in my head around this whole concept of. My book is about Trappist monks and about how these Trappist them and they're already aged and they only work about 4 hours a day, but they're very fabulously successful in business. So what's their secret? And in the introduction of the book, I just have their motto. What is their motto? Prayer and work. Labora, ora et labora, to pray, to work. And sort of thinking that, and as I said in my introduction, it's not that they don't make a distinction between those two things. Prayer is work, work is prayer. And to me, living your life with a attitude at work, the way the monks do, is one way of looking at this whole idea of presence. Another thing in my head along those lines is the old Zen koan, where the monk, the student walks up to the Zen master and says, "Master, what's the secret to Zen?" And he says, "Attention." And then he says, "But Master, what is the secret to Zen?" And he says, "Attention, attention." And then he says, "But yes, what's the Zen?" He says, "Attention, attention, attention." And it's all about, paying attention, being there. And the thing that popped in, well, I also thought of Gurdjieff and the whole idea of self-remembering, of always reminding yourself of why you're doing. Louis R. Mobley, who was my mentor, who founded the IBM Executive School, used to say all the time, the most important question in what is the business of the business? And I used to think, well, he's just saying, who are we? And all these Zen teachers, et cetera, of mine are, am I? So remembering that, all the time and staying true to it is what keeps you to something bigger than yourself while you're working at your job. And that requires, and then the final thing that popped in my head was, what is the opposite of presence? What does it mean to not be present? And I think that present are usually not present. And the answer I come back to always is fear. Is that we're afraid to show our own vulnerabilities, to show our own weaknesses, to be honest with ourselves and with other people. And as a result, we're so wrapped into our own problems and our own fears that we're not present. And so I would finally just what is your own personal integrity. I just put a quote on Facebook, which a lot of people seem to like recently. I said, it takes an enormous amount of work to learn how to just be yourself. And so finally, conquering those fears and being present means being yourself and showing yourself to the world in all of your vulnerabilities and all of your weaknesses. And that's all I have to say about that.
For now, at least. I'm sure you have some stories to tell later, Augie. One thing I can say about Augie, he's a great storyteller. So, on to you, Bob. What is your take on this topic?
Well, I'll just start by saying I don't think you can not be present. You are always presencing yourself in some way. And that, it's like one of the leaders we worked with, CEO of an organization, said, leaders bring the weather. And so when you walk into a room, you bring a certain countenance, you bring a certain energetic, you bring a certain mood, attitude, willingness to be vulnerable, authenticity, or not. And that affects the room. So I think of this as a room full of tuning forks, and when one tuning fork resonates, If they're the same tuning fork in us resonates. So everything resonates across the room. So you're constant. You know this when you walk into a room. You can feel the energy of that room more often than not. If it's fear and distance and cautious, I walked into a room a couple of weeks ago, and it was all very academic educators, and they were all very quietly in their own corners, and there was no interaction, and there was a palpable sense of distance. And walk into another room, and there's a palpable sense of welcome and so on. So you're always resonating a presence. And then the question for me becomes, to what extent are you doing that consciously? Are you able to modulate that presence in a way that serves the group or not? So I started working on this years ago. And as Augie said, it takes a tremendous amount of work to just be yourself and to show up fully. And so I started working in my workshops and team building sessions with my goal here is to just show up as fully, authentically, vulnerably. And of course, I have all those fears that Augie talked about, but how do I also just allow those to be there? And so in this particular workshop, it was a workshop with AT&T, I remember showing up pretty well day one. Like, wow, okay, that went pretty well. I was really present. Day two, I got scared, and I went distant, and I started to go in my head, and I got more rational, and I started to try to push and convince, and the group started to labor and resist and struggle in a way that it hadn't on day one. And so, of course, I blamed the group. This group doesn't get it. They're not evolved enough or advanced, And so I sat with that the night before, and I had a miserable day myself inside. And so I sat with that that night, and I just came to a conclusion, and it sort of went like, screw it. I'm just going to go in there and play tomorrow, and they're either going to like it or not like it, but I'm showing up. And I showed up again, and the day was extraordinary. I mean, it just was extraordinary. And what really convinced me about how powerful this is at the very first break, one of the senior managers came up to me in the room and said, "We're glad you're back." And I thought I had covered it over pretty well the day before. And I said to them, I said, "Oh, you noticed?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." And then what happened in that day was really quite extraordinary. And so I've been playing with this notion of how do you really show up with undefended, fiercely compassionate presence, because I think that's where transformation happens. It isn't so much what we do or say or techniques, it's the power of the presence with which we call upon and the container we create that actually creates transformative possibilities.
Very, very good story to illustrate that. I know from my own experience too that when we're able to show up, magic can happen. When we don't, it very seldom does. So, Bonnie, I know that from experience with some of your workshops, especially with the horses, that you have multiple modalities of working with this kind of presence. So what would you like to say now?
I think for me, speaking to the audience, is that a naive person could listen or read some of this information on presence and read things like presence is transformational, and I think Bob just showed why it's transformational, because that's an ordinary thing. If people are in yucky moods, then it transforms the space, right? So there's something very ordinary and shared by everyone in terms of this quality of presence, right? So by its very nature, the way we show up does transform the group, let's say, or the dynamics. And so for me, what's compelling about presence at work is the gap between the reality, right, what we feel like in our conventional workplace, in the possibility of thinking of work, thinking of the quality of presence of people organized together to participate in very creative and innovative projects. So this is a very compelling vision that I have to feel into what would work be like, what would group conversation be like, what would your ordinary everyday life be like if this transformation in the quality of presence that people had was more widespread. So I think that's a really interesting piece of imagination that is compelling. So for me, I think that I'd like to talk about presence as something that, yes, it can transform a group, but it's a transformation in yourself. And so one way to look at it is what happens to my body? What happens to my inner experience when I have that quality of presence? You know, my eyes become relaxed and time seems to slow down, and I have enough space and enough time to fit things in. And I like to have people think about, you know, when you kind of bump into a really beautiful baby with a naive smile, that way it opens you up, you know, and so we have these experiences, and if we can learn to memorize them, you know, memorize what does your body feel like when you see a baby, or, you know, in the morning when your puppies or your loved ones are just happy, or it's an ordinary beautiful day, and slow down and pay attention. And when you're at work, you know, search for that feeling. You can kind of re-engineer it backwards and let your body feel like that, and open your eyes and see the diversity of perceptual experience arising, and use your imagination to imagine that quality of presence, to let your body bring you into that transformation. So that's, you know, everybody said a lot of other things that I completely agree with. So that would be my contribution, is that we have the ability to memorize, take a body memory of that quality of presence, and try to feel for it, and try to let that bring us into that quality at the workplace.
Thanks, Bonnie. I can't help but be inclined to make a few comments myself, having had the opportunity to both learn from each of the panelists and to hear the comments now. I noticed the first thing is just the challenge of bringing a quality of presence into this medium. You know, I noticed myself distracted by the chat window, trying to look after technical things and make sure everything's flowing and functioning well. I noticed the tenseness that arose, and I couldn't get Google Hangouts to work properly an hour ago. But I also noticed then, kind of like Bonnie talking about the baby, it's like the quality of presence, it starts to settle into my body, and the way the tension in my muscles starts to relax as I hear each of you speak. And I reconnect with that sense of memory of those moments in each encounter that have brought something to a state of awareness or recognition in myself. And that's one of the ways in which I experience presence as arising in relationship. And whether it's with people, animals, the natural world, there is something that is present in the world that when we kind of get out of the way can reveal itself to us. And so I'm thinking about the phrase Bob used that I've used as well, that, you know, leaders make the weather in the workplace. And part of this, you know, on a conceptual level, I can see and think about as we are always kind of presencing this undifferentiated ground of being in the world, whether we call it spirit, soul, presence, whatever. and we are always differentiating it. We are always filtering or coloring it in some way as it flows through us. At the same time, one of the things that I've learned from Augie and the monks is, of course, that what we want to do is purify or lessen the influence of that coloring or filtering and become selfless. So the more we are able to step out of the way, the more this quality of presence can be present in any given moment. And the practice that I perceive leadership as being is simply a moment-to-moment remembrance of these states Bonnie's pointing to, so that we can presence them in each conversation, in each group, in each circumstance that we find ourselves in. And that this is all just scratching the surface of what we mean. So what I'm curious about now is what has this elicited in each of us? So for the audience, we have only scripted this far. We just said we're going to make some opening comments and see what arises. And even the introductions were not scripted. You can find websites and more formal bios for everybody on the website associated with this conversation. But what we really wanted to do was see, well, what arises in us? So, for instance, Bob, you have some thoughts that have arisen maybe in relation to what you've heard.
Yeah, I think, I don't know about the audience, but I think for the most part we don't have mental models that really support this notion very well. So, for example, I don't think we actually have a model that says that when we come together we create a field. That I, as an individual, have an energetic field around me, or that either, well, in the school that I went to, I was involved in the Barbara Brennan School of Healing for 4 years. The energetic field actually precipitates the body. And so, and it is resonant with our consciousness. So we are always emitting a field, and that impacts others. And so when we come together, there is a resonant field that we are co-creating together. And all of that creates or limits possibilities for what can happen in that space. And if we hold that, then we can actually get intentional about the quality of energy that we actually want to put in the space. And so, for example, if I'm working or coaching with someone, they may have a particular character structure or core issue or wound, and I actually don't want to connect with that just yet too deeply. It could trigger them or have them pull away. And so I might manage my energy and presence in a way that meets them at the level of vulnerability and resonates with them in a way that would be most supportive. And so being conscious about that. You can set energy in a room for the very kind of depth work that you want to have happen, or maybe it's not depth work, maybe it's much more action planning work and so on. And so how you use things like music, how you speak, the place in yourself from which you speak, all creates a field in which that creates more access or blocks access, depending on how it's done, to the very thing that is wanting to happen. And so I don't think of presence as this one thing. It's a whole range of how I can show up and deploy myself both physically but also energetically in a way that supports what wants to happen.
So when I hear that, there's something Bonnie had mentioned earlier, or at least in our email exchanges prior to this, And it also ties into something Augie had said. You know, Augie used the term attention, attention, attention. And there's also intention. So you're saying, Bob, that, you know, we can kind of have an intention to set the depth and kind of field we want in the room. And at the same time, there can be a tension between that and making space for emergence. How do we allow the new and the magical to happen? And so I'm curious what people think about that tension between our intentionality, our attention, and this kind of open, naive curiosity to what can emerge and what kind of conditions make us accident prone, which is a phrase I learned from Augie.
Well, John, you know, I was listening to what Bob had to say and talking about struggling with the fact that we have a difficult time with this model. And I think that the reason why we have a difficult time is because we're not very comfortable with paradoxical thinking. And to me, presence is always in between all the different opposites. So, for example, I could say that as a CEO of my own company, I had 2 companies that I built. I'm extremely intense. And my job, part of my job at least, was constantly trying to infuse intensity into my organization to build passion in the individuals who were in our company. And I noticed the same thing about the monks. People think the monks are all down there just blissing out all the time, and they're just cool, calm, and they're letting it all happen. No, they're extremely intense as well. And at the same time that they are blissed out and laid back and detached and all those kind of things. And so, and you know, and if you listen to athletes, you know, and I hate athletic analogies, but if you listen to athletes, I watch hockey, you know, they're constantly saying 2 different opposites. We've got to stay committed. We got to be there. We got to give it everything. But then we have to take it cool. We got to never get too excited. We got to just let it happen. We can't grip our sticks too high. So then they go, but then we got to really not, you know, we can't forget that everything's on the line. But on the other hand, we got to take it one day at a time. And so you notice that no matter who is talking about peak performance, they're always talking about trying and not trying at the exact same time. And I love that word attention, because the word attention comes from 2 words, at tension. And in my book, I talk also about detachment and how important detachment is, and the monks are detached. But if you think about it, it doesn't mean they don't care. They care incredibly amount. And the analogy that I use there is that people that think of a basketball player who is giving 150% extremely passionately, wants to win very, very, very much. Yet at the same time, he has to always remember that there's rules to this game. And he has to stay within those rules. And to the extent that he is staying present and aware, he doesn't screw things up for his teammates and himself by breaking the rules to the game. So you can be very, very passionate and give it 100%, and at the same time be centered in yourself, remembering what you're really all about, remembering what's really important. And I think that this is the fruit of an enormous amount of what we would call self-development, working on ourselves, you know, spiritual work, whatever you would say, that enables you to have this ability to try really, really hard, but not too hard. And that's, to me, the secret to the success and the best.
Thanks, Augie. I think that captures it well, the trying and not trying at the same time. So, Bonnie, you have some reflections to contribute.
Yeah, just first a comment as I'm enjoying Augie. I wrote down this little phrase, and it said, you know, a raw or a polished jewel. You know, some people have this sense that presence is this polished jewel, and I think Augie is reminding us that presence also has this character of a raw jewel, you know, something a little more raw. So that was kind of an aside, but I think we have to make a distinction here now, or else we'll get lost in kind of two different directions, and that is, I think there's in one sense, I'll use Augie's language, you're in a game and the rules are pretty stable. right? So in an athlete or a business with a very clear mission. And so this certain type of presencing, this attention, pay attention, and kind of like be in the zone and have your energy flow in that direction without too much distraction, and that kind of like middle space. So there's this pull, push here, and then you know, so that's one thing. But I think what Bob is talking about is more of where the rules are not only not clear, but they're emergent in the process, right? So you're not even, you have to be present and listen to, it's kind of like playing a game that is playing itself in real time, and that game is taking shape and never really becoming stable. And so I just wanted to make sure that we made this distinction. They both require a certain type of presence, but one is a little more kind of down the chute, and one is a little more that the game itself is what we have to presence. So this notion of what wants to emerge is the phrase you hear when people are in that kind of situation. So I just wanted to kind of suss that out a little.
Thanks. So, Anne, do you have some thoughts?
I can try. The paradox thing, and also what Augie said and what Bonnie said, I've been working in the past 16 years on that space and the quality of presence. Yeah, let me take reference also to what Bob said. In both instances, you interact with the field. Depending on your own quality, how you're being that day. If certain fears pop up, whatever gets triggered, and it works both ways, isn't it? It's perception works both ways. You perceive maybe through your filters, you project out to the others, and perception works inwards. So there's always this co-creation thing going on, and it depends on your, how you call it, awakeness. You're being aware of that. You're being present to what's happening in both directions, inward and outward. And that is a dance that sometimes is really paradoxical, and especially then if we add another dimension, so to say, it's not like, okay, the way I am being today is influencing my meeting, or the meeting is influencing me, so in both ways, and I can play with that. There's a whole different dimension in what Bonnie says. It's like, okay, and now let's get rid of that. Let's be aware. Let's work on our attention, on our personal integrity. There's no filters, no fears, no nothing that can influence my being completely aware, completely enacting presence, completely be there in the moment, and then feel for, I don't know if it's a third dimension or something else, that's subtle, what wants to emerge, what Otto Scharmer says, that, like leading from the future as it emerges, feeling for what wants to move in the room. I can be, if I'm completely in that space, I can be sure that whatever is arising, it's not my stuff because I cleared that out. It's not something that comes as a projection in from the other part because they have cleared that out. And so there becomes a collective something really exquisite pops in, some beauty, and everybody can feel it, and this is the flow area that sometimes people are really then awake and say, wow, there's something, and then somebody catches it, and it doesn't matter who. So there's a whole different quality, but and sometimes it doesn't actually need a lot of work to get there. Sometimes you're right there, but it also, on the other hand, again, maybe a paradox. You need to work for it. You need to have you work on your own quality. You work on your stuff that gets triggered, on your fears, on your non-integrity issues, or you work on on you being a different person if others are in the room, and it depends who is with you in the room. So it's always an emergent field in a way. It's always in movement. There's nothing static to it, and you need to navigate or serve all the directions that it takes, and it's engaging.
It's a dance.
Yeah.
So as I was listening,
sometimes it's excruciating before it becomes a dance, and sometimes it's really beautiful straight on. So
as I was listening, I had this phrase come up that I kind of learned from the Jesuit education that I had, and so really the proper answer to anything is it depends. We really don't know in advance. We need to be present in the moment to see what is the context, what is emerging, what is the dynamic, what is our attention, what is our intention, what are all these things. And as I listened to the kind of dance between the inward and outward, and how are we projecting or filtering or doing one of these things, and we're talking about emergence in the process or trying and not trying, I go back to something Bob said very early on, which was we don't have good mental models for these things. And I think part of what I want to acknowledge is that while we are doing our best to use language to point to phenomena, it's also this sense that we know the phenomena when we experience it. We have this kind of existential, Bob talked about the resonance or the tuning. We recognize it in those moments. Our ability to make it happen or create an articulation that adequately encompasses or describes or elicits it is where we run into the kind of the dualistic nature of the worlds of mind and matter and so on. And that in a sense then we're pointing to something non-dual. We're saying there is something about presence that has a quality to it that is beyond all our conceptions, but we recognize. And of course the question then that arises for me is, who is it that does this recognizing?
So I agree that we don't have good mental models for, let's just call it this phenomenon broadly. But I think that one of the challenges and kind of reflecting on what is our responsibility in terms of languaging this is that we can work much more closely and more accurately if we work with describing the phenomenon in first-person experiences, right? So, because when we're using more abstract, the field or some people think there's a circle being or some kind of quantum. These things I don't think are helpful. I think they point people into a complexity that puts them in the wrong direction. And I think that we can be of service if we can continually point to the quality of our lived experience in very clear terms to point to this phenomenon. So, for example, I work with horses, and I bring people who've never been with horses as part of this retreat for consciousness studies, and I give them, they choose a horse. Primarily the horse chooses them, and they stand there next to the horse. 5 horses that don't know them. They don't know horses. The horses are not well trained, and if you can describe a state of physical being in which the horse will not eat the hay, the horse will stand there at attention in it's very beautiful, relaxed, but it's a high energy, not a low energy state. And people can bond with the horse. The horse is attracted to the quality of presence. That's what we can say. So I think part of the solution to being in service to increasing presence is to not necessarily look for mental models, because they get projected on by the mind, but really try to give very, very personally lived experienced type of examples of what does it feel like to be in presence. What does that feel like? Can you recognize that in yourself? So I think that's something that I'm working on anyways.
So as I hear that, I'm reminded of lots of stories that many people tell that have a quality of that. There's something in storytelling that evokes that kind of first-person mythology. Bob, do you have some comments about that?
Well, I was actually going to pick up on a slightly different theme. I think I like the idea of actual lived experience and story. There's also been a theme in here of, Anne said it can be excruciating before it becomes a dance. Augie talked about your own fears and the work that's required to get more and more capable of being present. And just from my own experience, I have a lot of fear. And I don't know if I'm unusual in that, but I have a lot of fear. And so I'm constantly, before an event or a meeting, I'm constantly noticing that and actively working it. So I can show up, or at least be aware in the moment when I might get triggered and go into some sort of reactive defensive posture that would have me not being as present as my intention in the moment would be. So I think there is a lot of work on getting to know and learning how to unhook from the ways that we get in our own way of being more fully present. So I had a meeting once with a guy named Lonnie, and I had to do an organizational assessment, which was pretty severe, and give it to him. And I knew it was going to be a tough meeting. The people who reported to him called him, his name was Lonnie, they called him Osama bin Lonnie. Just to give you a sense for what it was like to interact with this man. I didn't know him very well. And I knew that it was possible. I was a consultant to the organization, and it was a significant opportunity for me. I knew it was possible that after this meeting, I would no longer be a consultant to that organization. And I had to come to grips with that, and so I made a conscious choice to walk in with nothing to gain or lose. My job here is to serve the client as best I can, be present, be compassionate, be truthful, come what may. And I knew that it was going to be tough, and so I was working on a choice to be in connection, stay heart connected to this man, no matter what happens. And then I had to work all my own fears of what was going to happen and so on and so forth so that I could be present in that way. And what happened was remarkable. I mean, it went about the way I expected. Within about a minute, he was standing up, walking around the room, angry as all get out, coming back at me with expletives. And I knew that if I broke contact, if I broke presence, the game was over with him. And we stayed in it and stayed in it. And I said to him at one point, you know, this is hard for me to push with you because we haven't built a trusting relationship yet. And he goes, you're right, I wouldn't trust you as far as I could throw you. And then staying present to that. And eventually, I won't go the whole story. This was actually a day later in a subsequent meeting. He looked at me and he says, look, I know where we need to go. I know what we need to do. He said, in fact, you think I like who I've become in this organization? I hate who I'd become in this organization. I couldn't believe what was happening in the moment. And I don't really know how anything I said led to this, but I think it was the quality of presence and the container that was built, and finally he decided to step through and really put it out there. And that built, we had a bond of trust that then proceeded for years as I worked with that organization. And so there is, I think, a lot of work about intention and purpose and choice, and then clearing how do I manage myself or know my habits of going out of connection, out of presence, so that I can really show up and stay in integrity. I think that is an ongoing piece of work. At least it is for me.
That's a great story, Bob, and it really brings to my mind the core principles I remember from Augie's book too. That the business model of the monks is service and selflessness. And I think that, Augie, you probably have stories from either business or the monks that illustrate that kind of service and selflessness that I think is very much what Bob was just describing, of being there in service of the client and being selfless, not reacting. So do you have something to share, Augie?
Well, yes. And the first thing, I mean, a lot of it, Bob got me really thinking along these lines, is I think that we have to remind people, care what you think, and I don't care what you say, I care what you do. And Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is not a choice, it's a habit. And one last thing I'll throw, that old definition, that old, nobody even knows who said this originally, what's your thoughts because they become your actions? What's your actions because they become your habits? What's your habits because they become your character? And what's your character because it's your destiny? And I think that oftentimes we try to figure it out rather than, as an old mentor of mine said. I asked him one time, well, you've had 5 companies and you've been really successful. He said, well, most of what I do is I run around breaking up meetings, shouting at the top of my lungs. Don't sit there trying to figure it out, get out there and try to find out. And I think a lot of even presence and things is a question of, I set off on a quest in my life to find out what it was. And what that meant for me was making a lot of decisions and putting myself in a lot of awkward situations, failing a lot, looking stupid, looking for different kinds of teachers, but always, and I found out rather than figured out that a lot of what I was looking for was a byproduct of all the behaviors and actions and trying and that I was trying to do. So I would try, and I would realize I was trying too hard, and I would try not to try, and I would realize I wasn't trying hard enough. Trying back and forth until you finally figure out a way to find that what I call poise. But what I would like to say is one of the discoveries I made about service and selflessness that resonated so much with my experience with the monks is that I was a very, very good salesman, and I ended up selling a magazine, and then I had a company that in a marketing company that I built. And what all great salesmen know is that the more that they forget about themselves, forget about their product, forget about their commissions, and forget about their quota, and fanatically focus on serving their customers' wants and needs, all the other things take care of themselves. They move more product, they make more money, they have more quota, they make their quota more easily. When companies fanatically focus on serving their customers and serving their constituencies rather than worrying about their profit, they make more profit. And as I often say, the purpose of, the reason you should want to be a leader, the way to measure yourself is you don't become a leader to become successful. You become a leader in order to make other people successful. And the more successfully you make other people successful, then as a byproduct of that, you get promoted more quickly. And it's easy to say and hard to do, and this is what I saw in the monks doing all the time in all of their area. The one last wanted to throw to finish up with the Bonnie, because I agree with you 100%, Bonnie. When I used the idea of rules, passion versus rules or whatever with the monks, the rules with the monks, or what hopefully in our own company was, the emergent values represent the rules. am I tempted here with my passion and my commitment to go against my ethics, to go against my emergent properties? And if that happens, no, I'm going to be detached enough to remember, no, this game that I'm into is a way in which I am trying to implement my emergent and how give them a place to grow, not to a place to violate them. But I think that in every area of my life, I've found that the more successfully I manage to forget myself, it is in my own self-interest to forget my self-interest, that the more I forget myself, the more successful I become.
Thanks for that, Augie. Anne, you have something to chime in with.
Yeah, thanks for both contributions. I really relate to the story from Bob. I had a similar one once. I inherited a project in southern Italy where I lived, and I lived in Rome, and the Roman organization I worked for, the WWF, and they screwed up the relationship with a natural park in the south, and I inherited this project, and I went there. I went to see the director of the park. He let me wait for an hour to see him because he wanted to stay. He was really pissed with how he was treated, and there was a value clash between the Romans and the people from Calabria. And as you can imagine from Godfather and other films, they run on respect. They run on different values. So I went all the way down there, took a car, drove up, and waited. And then he sat me down in front of him, and he accused me of all the mistakes that, in his opinions, were made. And I did the same as Bob. I completely kept the connection, and I didn't any justification. It just says, yeah, you're absolutely right. That's not the way to treat you, and I really apologize. And I kept the connection. I really meant it. So he stared at me with really strange eyes for 2 minutes, and then he said, "Chiamami Gregorio." Gregorio, so by his first name. So, and then that was the ice was broken, and it was a great working relationship. I had to stand a lot of fears. I'm not good in the face of aggression. I'm not good in the face of mistakes. So I had to work on that, and it brings me to a point that for me is important because it's also what Augie talked about, this kind of passion, this kind of serving, this kind of selfless leader is an acquired taste. It's an acquisition. That doesn't come easy to me. I have to fight. I have to fight for keeping my attention. I have to fight for not giving into my justifications of winging it, of cutting corners, of taking shortcuts, where my whole brain is unfortunately really fixed, really quick to come up with all kinds of ways out, and I have to work against my brain to really stand there and be there and be present, and while the rest of my body is not courageous, it wants to faint, wants to run away and be that, and so that brings me to a different point. Maybe also for the audience, it's like I have since I have worked so much on keeping a quality of presence on also professionally in the workplace, despite of myself and despite of some of my ingrained habits. There's a lot of how to say, if some people then go it the easy way, I get allergic to that and saying, oh, just be present, come on, be authentic. Oh, you have to keep the space, and it's kind of like almost a profanation of that work, or of the way to get there to such a presence, and I think in some of the people we work with, it's become like an easy currency, and that becomes also almost like a false one, like a counterfeit currency, And I just want to say that's not it. It cannot be it. That because the kind of presence that Bob was talking about, that kind of fearless, despite of your fear, fearless holding that space, the willingness to give up on a $1 million assignment because you're more committed to the truth and more committed to serving than to getting that job. That's work. That's really work, and you don't get there the easy way. And that kind of presence it's a made-up word. It's kind of reality active. It has an impact, a net impact on reality. But you cannot fake it, and you cannot get there through shortcuts and say, yeah, right, I hold the space, I have appreciation and something like that. So that's what I just wanted to say.
Cool. What I notice is listening to the stories that each of you have been telling, that the quality of presence and engagement on the conversation and the call seems to deepen and settle and evoke, at least in my experience, more of how I know each of you. And I'm very appreciative of that. As I was listening to what you were saying, Anne, many things came to mind around this tension that when something is authentic and we recognize that it has this quality to it, and then inevitably we try and make a mental model of it, the mind or the system of thought tries to appropriate it and then tries to recreate it, but not represents it. And in that recreation, in very subtle ways, that essence can slip away and get missed. And that line of thought had led me to some inquiry and writing I did lately. I do a lot of work with the Immunity to Change process, which, linked with the leadership circle that Bob created, I found has been a great way to help people on this journey of kind of beginning to disidentify with some of those mental constructs, some of the ways in which they believe themselves to be this or that, rather than relaxing into selflessness. And as I was doing this inquiry and this writing, one of the things that came to me through a number of sources was this idea that, well, one word we haven't used much yet is awareness. There is something about being aware, not just in a kind of mental, conscious way, but an awareness that evokes this trans-rational or trans-mental or transpersonal sense of being. And as I was trying to wrestle with, well, what does awareness really mean? What came up was this notion that awareness is the embodied realization of the virtuality of self. And in that way, this notion of being selfless is the culmination of the gradual peeling away of notions of identity and mental constructs that the mind has created about who we are in the world. And the more we can clear that out of the way, the more we can be present to what wants to emerge and intentional about how we want to, as you say, be reality active. How do we want to contribute and serve in the world, given not just the talents we have, but also our own reactiveness, our own shadows? How do we engage those things in service in the world? So we have about 10 minutes left, I believe. So maybe we could do a round of closing reflections, maybe starting with you, Bob. You got to unmute yourself, Bob.
Sorry,
be present.
That was brilliant for that short time. I just want to close with what for me was one of the most poignant experiences of presence in my life. We were at a meeting. I won't get into the context of it, but it was very spiritual we were actively experimenting with the unity that we are. And of course, the Trappists would understand this immediately, that there's only an inherent unity that we are arising as, a divine inherent unity. So we were playing with this, and we were in a dialogue, and I began to experiment with listening to you, with being present to you and listening to you as if what you were saying was exactly and only what this inherent unity wanted to speak in this moment. And what then was arising in me, that sort of as an unreflected response, was exactly what that unity that we are together wanted to say in that moment. And the quality of listening and attention and presence that emerged in that group and for me, I've never experienced before. It was unparalleled. To really hold the other as the same one as I am. You know, Jesus said, treat your neighbor as yourself. Well, what if your neighbor is yourself? And there's one of us having this emergent conversation. So I'll leave it at that. It was an extraordinary level of presence and listening and attention and magic that emerged, holding the other and holding myself as one.
Thanks, Bob. Who wants to check out next?
I'll go ahead. John, I was thinking, I really liked your comments very, very much. I mean, because I oftentimes think that it's pretty easy to sling a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, and you really end up wondering, what have you really paid for it? I mean, have you really paid for any of these ideas? And so I started thinking, and I want to tell a quick story. I mean, but John mentioned to me that there's a couple of stories in my book, but this one is not in my book. But John had met me through this Self-Knowledge Symposium, which was this volunteer thing that I do with college students with transpersonal and human growth and all this stuff, and it's a volunteer basis. And I was working for a software company here in the North Carolina area, and it was a very exciting company, but it was having cash flow problems. So long story short, I was in charge of sales, and I had been deferring some of my income, so they owed me about $100,000. And they were trying to raise money, and what the CEO comes to me one day and he says, listen, we're having an emergency meeting tomorrow night, board of directors, we're having a cash crunch, you're an officer in the company, you have to be there. I said, I won't be there. And he said, why not? I said, because I teach my college students on Tuesday nights. And he said, well, that's just a volunteer thing. The kids don't even get credit for what you're doing. I said, yeah, that's right. He said, well, why don't you reschedule the damn class? I said, why don't you reschedule the meeting? I said, the only thing sure is I will not be at that meeting tomorrow night because I will be with my college students tomorrow night. And Bob, was kind of like one of those moments, where we locked there, and the long story short is that he ended up with a whole new level of respect, I think, with me, and it actually improved our relationship. But frankly, I was willing to walk out the door that day and leave $100,000 behind because I was going to my meeting with my college students that night. And to me, this is where this is where it really comes down to. What is your priorities in life? And these are the rules that I mentioned, that I always try to stay detached, that no matter how involved I am, no matter how much money is on the line, no matter how much I care about this company or everything, then my priority in life that I have to remember all the time is my spiritual path, is God for the monks. That's their rule. They're never going to compromise. If it comes down to the biggest order in the world just came in for eggs or mushrooms, but it's time for them to go to church because they go to Vespers at 6 o'clock, they're going to Vespers. And that's they're detached. They're always going to remember that no matter, God bless, and people understand that and they actually appreciate it. So I think this is this is an this is an important thing. What are you willing to pay for your beliefs and your ideas, and how present you want to be, and what are your priorities, and what do you really do when the what comes down, and it's going to come down, and you're going to have to pay the price. And if you don't find yourself being asked to pay the price, then you're probably not present enough in your own life. You're not involved enough. You're not committed enough. You're not passionate enough, because you should be coming up against these challenges and these difficult choices in your life. So, Anna, I liked very much what you had to say.
Thanks, Augie, and I think hopefully all of the people watching this get the opportunity to feel the kind of force of nature coming through the screen there at that moment. So, Anne or Bonnie, who's next? We got 4 minutes left.
I'd just say a quick thing. I think yeah, we've been talking about a lot of the interior condition to how to be present, and what that presence then can be in terms of being reality active. But I think a lot of people struggle with today's information overload in the outside world, and we've been working with kids lately, and the complaint is that the structures nowadays are so geared to distraction and emails coming in and texts coming in and computer games all over the place. So there's also, I think, a need to redesign our workplaces so they actually can foster also, it's a lot of work to keep up with that interior space and to acquire that, but the outside design of the structures don't help at the moment either. So I'll close there. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I really enjoyed this time, and for me what's really resonating is this notion, can you hear me? Yeah? So, is this notion of, it seems to me that presence has a lot to do with connection and staying connected. And the challenge is that this is a panel on presence at work, in the workplace, to stay connected means to be able to stay with who we really are. There's a man who hates the position he's in, whose job is on the line, whose children are on the line. The amount of tension and distraction, as Anne said, or this compulsion around money. This is the quality of our human experience. And to be present with that, to transform that, to transmute that, requires a certain capacity. And I love Bob's examples of being able to be with that without denying or rejecting it, to stay connected with it, because that is truly what is coursing through hundreds of thousands of people at work every day. And our ability to be able to be with that, to presence that, is the transformational move. It's not about making everything nice or smoothing it over. It's to presence what is. And I think that that's, Bob really illustrated the challenge that it is, and, gives us some kind of sense of cultivating the capacity to be with what is, and to be that kind of conduit, to allow that energy to flow and to open up new spaces of possibility. So yeah, that was really, I think, a wonderful kind of emergent way of looking at presence that I'm grateful for.
Thanks, Bonnie. I think in the minute or a few seconds that we have left, I'm reminded of just from something you said. Somebody gave this definition of spirit at a talk I was at 30-some years ago, and that I think it evokes that kind of quality you're talking about. That the definition is very simple: that spirit is always becoming more than itself. And how do we, as soul at work, as presence in the workplace, how do we simply, as Socrates said, all learning is an act of remembering. How do we remember that divine connection and essence and presence and bring it into the world. And the challenges that Anne and others were mentioning in the world are simply the tools that we are gifted with to temper soul, to cultivate the capacity to be present with this unconditional love for whatever is.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and all of you. We've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. I just want to say that was an absolutely beautiful conversation, and in particular, I appreciate how it would have been easy to take talk about presence to a very theoretical place, but instead what you all leaned towards was sharing personal life experiences, and so it became very vulnerable and had a lot of energy to it, and so it seemed like you were practicing what you're preaching in a big way, and so I appreciated that. So thank you all so much, and thanks to our listeners, and we encourage you to join us for our next live conversation in the Soul at Work series, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Nice. Thank you.